is having a good time watching the world or Western governments tearing their hair out, first of all, and then tying themselves in knots, trying to figure out what to do about Israel, Gaza, and now this latest development. And I think, James, one lesson learned from this is that the Wagner Group could actually expand its activities from terrestrial-based ones to naval ones and water-based ones. And so I wouldn't be surprised if we saw, maybe not tomorrow or this month, but in the future, if we saw the Wagner Group just appearing on various vessels in the Baltic Sea, disrupting the incredibly busy traffic there. And that traffic, like all shipping traffic, depends on everybody behaving and following the rules. Well, what if the Wagner Group were to arrive in the Baltic Sea and harass vessels there? What would anybody do about it? What would they be able to do? And again, would they risk a conflict with Russia over harassment of merchant shipping?
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio. I'm James Hansen, and today we're talking about the crisis in the Red Sea, where attacks by Yemeni Houthi rebels are causing increased pressure on global supply chains. I'm delighted to be joined by Elisabeth Braw, a columnist at Foreign Policy and a Senior Associate Fellow at the European Leadership Network. Elisabeth, welcome to Frontline.
Thank you for having me.
First of all, can you just give us an overview on what has been happening in the Red Sea in recent weeks?
Yeah, we have seen an extraordinary turn of events in the Red Sea. So when the Israel-Gaza conflict erupted, some people, including me, predicted that Iran would retaliate by targeting Israeli ships in the Strait of Hormuz, and instead, the situation took a somewhat different twist in that the Houthis, who are a militia in Yemen, started targeting commercial vessels linked to Israel, and that link is defined by the Houthis, so you never really know. So either way, the Houthis began targeting commercial vessels in the Red Sea. So a really extraordinary development. And we should remember that this is the first time that a non-state group has been able to successfully attack large tankers going about their business. This is not piracy. This is one step up from piracy. And what we're seeing is that merchant vessels or shipping companies and governments are really struggling to figure out what to do about it, because it's not just one attack. It's an increasing number of attacks, an accelerating number of attacks.
And there was one particular attack that drew a lot of attention, in part because the Houthis actually released video footage of it on the Galaxy Leader. Just tell us about this.
Yeah, so that was the first attack, and it took place at the end of November. And the Houthis really demonstrated that they are a force to reckon with. So they landed on this merchant vessel and seized it and took the crew hostage. And not only did they successfully do that, they also filmed the whole thing so that the rest of the world could admire or be shocked by their skills and capabilities. And that's exactly what they wanted to achieve. They wanted merchant vessels sailing through the Red Sea to be frightened of the Houthis, and that's exactly what happened.
And using helicopters to land on a vessel, is that a new tactic?
It is. It's a new tactic for non-state actors. So we have seen Iranian forces do it in the past, and I think your listeners will remember the Stena Impero, UK-owned or UK-linked ship, I should say, that was attacked by the Revolutionary Guards of Iran in 2019, and they too landed with a helicopter, or rather they abseiled from a helicopter onto the Stena Impero. Very effective footage, and now we are seeing the Houthis, Iran's proxy friends, do this virtually the same thing again on a merchant vessel sailing past.
And you mentioned the Houthis say they will target any Israeli-linked ship in the Red Sea. How are they defining Israeli-linked ship or vessel?
It's very mysterious, and I think that's part of the plan. We should remember, first of all, that trying to identify, trying to figure out what nationality a merchant vessel is very complicated. Most merchant vessels sail under one flag, are owned in a different country, and have crew members from all kinds of countries, and cargo going to and from yet other countries. So the Houthis have said that they will target Israel-linked shipping, and so they are essentially deciding for themselves what constitutes an Israel-linked vessel. So you can't say, if you're a UK owned or flagged vessel, you can't say, well, then it's safe for us because we are UK flagged or UK owned. The Houthis can decide that you're linked to Israel and they target you, which is why this development or this string of attacks has global shipping really concerned, and even to the point that the major shipping lines are saying we're not going to sail through the Red Sea anymore.
And I suppose an illustration of that, Elisabeth, is that recently they fired a missile at a Norwegian-owned tanker that was heading for Italy, I think.
That's right. Yeah. So you can say nobody hates Norway. Nobody really hates Norway, but the Houthis can decide that this Norwegian owned vessel is linked to Israel because the Houthis assume that the cargo was going to Israel. But it really doesn't matter whether any of that is true. They can just decide that a vessel is linked to Israel, and that means that every other vessel or every vessel traveling through the Red Sea will have to worry that the Houthis will decide that vessel is linked to Israel. It really is a brilliant strategy.
To what extent will the Houthis have been directed to do this by Iran? And of course, most people see the Houthis as really a proxy for Iran. Or do you think this was something they did independently, but will simply be being cheered on by Iran?
It's hard to know really what went on in the corridors of power involving Iran and the Houthis. But what is true is that Iran has managed something much better than the West in its relationship with its proxies, which is to keep them close and to work collaboratively. If we think about the West's various effort to build proxy forces and to work with them, it has never really worked very well. Whereas the Iranians do manage to nurture and collaborate with our proxy forces. I think it's safe to assume that Iran is involved with this, even if it may not have been Iran's idea, but it certainly has a hand in seeing it come to pass. And also, if you look at the sort of weapons the Houthis are using, it's unlikely that the Houthis would have been able to acquire them on their own. So there is Iranian involvement, but it's also far enough from Iran that the Iranian government can say, well, what are you talking about? These are the Houthis. We do our own thing. And so it's very hard for, I think, Western governments to punish Iran for this, even if they were to seek to punish Iran, because Iran could say, well, hang on, the perpetrator in this case is the Houthi militia, and why are you targeting us? And the second thing about that is that if you were to retaliate against Iran, then you might risk an armed conflict with Iran. So that would be dangerous on its own terms.
That's a good point. I suppose from Iran's perspective, they have plausible deniability with these attacks. Hamas, however, welcoming what they've been seeing.
Absolutely. And so this is really a remarkable turn of events in the Israel-Gaza conflict, because it's escalating, but it's not escalating in the traditional ways and the sort of ways that Western governments may have planned for. They may have thought of. In fact, they have thought of various armed ways in which it could escalate, but they didn't really think about the Houthis beginning to target global shipping. I don't think they realized that the Houthis had these capabilities, and they also didn't realize that the Houthis might be that creative. And here we are, the whole world being affected by the Israel-Gaza conflict spilling over to global shipping. And we should remember that global shipping companies themselves are not in a position to defend themselves against missile attacks or drones or forces landing on their vessels. They can a maximum defend themselves against scrappy pirates, but this is different.
Well, let's come on to that. What has been the impact in the last few weeks on global shipping?
It has been a dramatic impact. So first, when we saw the attack on the Galaxy leader, we saw a lot of alarm among shipping companies, and we saw a couple of shipping lines saying, well, we'll divert a couple of vessels that were heading towards the Red Sea. And now, within just the past couple of weeks, we have seen shipping companies saying that it's not safe to sail through the Red Sea. And within the past couple of days, they've diverted their whole fleet away from the Red Sea. And they will take the historic route now along the they will take the historic route now along the Cape of Good Hope, which is much further away, and that's why the Suez Canal was so important when it was introduced. And now they can't use the Suez Canal because they can't go through the Red Sea. They will have to sail along the Cape of Good Hope, which adds up to 2 weeks of shipping time, and obviously massive logistical disruption, because then the cargo won't get to where it needed to be 2 days ago or at a certain time. So it is a dramatic development, and so we'll see lots of goods not arriving where they're supposed to be, lots of costs being added, and shipping companies not being able to plan properly for the deliveries that have to function and have to arrive at a specific time, or otherwise the globalized economy will stutter.
And on the flip side, if some of these big shipping companies still decide they're going to take the risk of passing through the Red Sea, there are increased costs for them still, because they have so-called war insurance, don't they? And of course, their premiums will go up because of the situation currently.
Correct. So if you sail through risky waters, you have to have war risk insurance. And if you sail to the UK, you don't have to buy that insurance. But there is a list of risky countries and risky waters, I should say. And the Red Sea was already on it. And now the risk has risen further up to 0.7% war risk premiums, which means that you pay around 0.7% of the value of your cargo. And that's not an insignificant amount. And it's in fact almost as much as you pay if you want to risk traveling to Ukrainian and Russian Black Sea ports, which is obviously a very risky thing to do. So there are almost no ports in the world, no waters in the world as risky and as expensive in terms of war risk insurance as Red Sea is at the moment.
And so I suppose you can understand why some really big companies like BP now are saying, well, we're just not going to sail through the Red Sea currently.
Correct, and so it's the value or the fee, the price the shipping lines have to pay for their war risk insurance premiums if they want to sail through the Red Sea. But it's also the risk of their vessels being harmed. And yes, they will get an insurance payout if their vessels are harmed, but they may reason, and in fact they are reasoning that it's not worth sailing through the Red Sea. Even if you get insurance money back, you may want to choose a safer route, which is what they are doing. Because if your vessel is taken hostage by the Houthis, you have a one vessel less, and so your entire logistics apparatus then has to be reworked at not just great expense but massive headache.
What's been the response, Elisabeth, from Western navies?
They are trying to help. So they regularly sail through the Red Sea, and the US Navy had vessels nearby anyway at the end of November, and they tried to help when the Galaxy leader was attacked. They also tried to help, and did help when another vessel was attacked around the same time called Central Park. French naval vessels have been trying to help, even a Japanese naval vessel, but that was just because they happened to be nearby. Now the US has cobbled together a coalition of different countries, including the UK, that will send vessels to the Red Sea to essentially frighten the Houthis. And that coalition is called, or the operation is called Operation Prosperity Guardian, which is so apropos or suited to the task at hand, because it really is about saving shipping and, as a result, global prosperity. But it's unclear, though, James, what these naval vessels can actually do. Are they going to fire at the Houthis if they attack more merchant vessels? And if they do so, they risk the Houthis firing back, and then the Iranians possibly intervening on behalf of the Houthis. So it's very, very risky. And the question or the dilemma for these navy this navy force that is being deployed to the Red Sea is it worth risking a conflict, an armed conflict with Iran to protect global shipping? And I don't know the answer to that because global shipping is so indispensable, but yet we wouldn't want an armed conflict with Iran.
And just put this into context, if you can, Elisabeth. How unusual is it to see commercial shipping dragged so directly into a conflict? I mean, we've seen it to an extent with what's been happening in Ukraine and Russia around the Black Sea, but some people say that was almost shipping getting caught in the crossfire. Here, it seems like it's been dragged directly into the field of conflict.
That is indeed the case. So shipping has always been vulnerable to geopolitics, and if you look at World War One, World War Two, various and merchant vessels were actually targeted and sunk. But it was not an organized campaign against merchant vessels. And when there was one, for example, in World War One, when the Royal Navy blockaded ships going to Germany, and as a result, essentially caused starvation in Germany and Austria. It was just a blockade. It wasn't a matter of shooting at those vessels or trying to sink them. And that's what we are seeing now, that the vessels are being directly targeted because the Houthis have discovered that you can have enormous effect on global affairs by targeting merchant vessels, because they are everywhere. They are in every country's waters, and they just happen to be near Yemen. So they are a very convenient target, and they, like other civilian outfits, are not allowed to shoot back or otherwise engage in aggressive action back. So they are just they are sitting ducks as they sail through the Red Sea. And then the other thing is that it used to be the case, or has been the case since the Second World War, that countries, governments have accepted that we have to follow the rules of the maritime regulations, because it's in everybody's interest that ships be able to travel safely and deliver the goods that they need to deliver. But now, what do you do if you have a non-state outfit that says we don't care? We don't care about global dependency on shipping, and we get our supplies from elsewhere. And by the way, we want maximum impact for the point we're trying to make. And I worry, James, that more militias and non-state groups will say, well, look at how much attention the Houthis are getting. Everybody's talking about it. We'll do that too with ships traveling through our waters or our country's waters.
And is the strategic objective of the Houthis here, Elisabeth, to really increase pressure on Israel from its Western allies, who will be feeling the pinch of the commercial implications of this?
It absolutely is, and we will be feeling the pinch of global shipping disruption. And Western governments, as your listeners know, are already making the case to Israel that this conflict really shouldn't last for much longer. But now there is the additional concern that has nothing to do with Palestinian lives, but instead has to do with global supplies and the functioning of our economies. And it sort of heads or it makes the same point or these different strands essentially end up in the same argument that the war shouldn't last much longer. And it comes from completely different directions. But the Houthis have discovered that this is a way in which they can put pressure on Western governments through their consumers, because we would all be up in arms against, forgive the pun, we would all be up in arms against our governments if we were to find that the goods and indeed the petrol we need didn't arrive or stopped arriving.
We've talked about the reaction from Hamas and from Iran. Just wonder, what will Vladimir Putin be looking on thinking?
He is having a good time watching the world or Western governments tearing their hair out, first of all, and then tying themselves in knots, trying to figure out what to do about Israel, Gaza, and now this latest development. And I think, James, one lesson learned from this is that the Wagner Group could actually expand its activities from terrestrial-based ones to naval ones and water-based ones. And so I wouldn't be surprised if we saw, maybe not tomorrow or this month, but in the future, if we saw the Wagner Group just appearing on various vessels in the Baltic Sea, disrupting the incredibly busy traffic there, and that traffic, like all shipping traffic, depends on everybody behaving and following the rules. Well, what if the Wagner Group were to arrive in the Baltic Sea and harass vessels there? What would anybody do about it? What would they be able to do? And again, would they risk a conflict with Russia over harassment of merchant shipping?
That's really interesting. So you think Vladimir Putin won't just be looking on favourably at it because it causes more headaches for the West. He'll actually be learning lessons from this.
Absolutely, because you can say, as a regime in a particular country, whatever such and such proxy force does, it's not me. I have nothing to do with it, and yet that proxy force can do things as effectively as if you were to do it yourself, and yet you have that plausible deniability, that distance from that force, which is exactly what Putin used to do with the Wagner Group in Ukraine. He used to say, "Well, the Wagner Group has nothing to do with us. I've never heard of it." And then, of course, it came out that it was very much linked to the Russian government. But you can feign ignorance and let that proxy get away with such activities. And it's not just Russia either. We are seeing China harass Philippine vessels in the South China Sea, and causing considerable headaches for shipping companies there. Now, is the U.S. Navy going to sail up and chase those Chinese vessels away? I think shipping would benefit if that were to be the case, but once again, the U.S. would then risk an armed conflict with China, and might be too risky an undertaking for the U.S. Navy, and it would also be an additional one on top of the Red Sea, of the Strait of Hormuz, and indeed of the Baltic Sea.
Elisabeth, this February, you are releasing a new book. It's called Goodbye Globalization, The Return of a Divided World. Just tell us a bit about it.
Yes. So 2-3 years ago, I felt that globalization was beginning to stumble, and it wasn't just sort of me sticking my finger up and sensing where the wind was heading, but it was based on conversations with people in the business community. And I spoke with my editor at Yale University Press, and she liked the idea and let me write this book. And it became more and more timely as I was working on it. And it became obvious that globalization really was stumbling in all kinds of ways, not just as a result of geopolitics and the standoff between Russia and China on one hand, and aided by Iran and other countries, and the West on the other hand, but also because people in our own countries in the West were essentially saying, what is this globalization about? It doesn't benefit me. I never asked for it. So it was various things coming together. And on top of that, China began to crack down on the private sector in China, both Western companies and Chinese ones, because the Chinese government felt threatened by the success of the market economy there. And so now we have this extraordinary situation where globalization is stumbling even more by the day, and the Houthi attacks on global shipping are just the latest chapter of that. So the book is about the rise and fall of globalization, and it's told through the experiences of business leaders who were there at the beginning and lived through the peak of globalization, and then saw their life's achievement beginning to just crumble in front of them, and there are also politicians that are part of it, and then indeed next generation the next generation, so Gen Z, how do they view globalization, and how do they think we should build up the next chapter of globalization? Because that globalization 2.0 will come, and I hope it will be a bit better designed than this one, and will also take climate, for example, into account.
And how are you defining in the book, Elisabeth, globalization? Because you could almost split it into different categories. There's economic globalization, but then there's political globalization with, the spread of democracy and freedom around the world appears to have stalled. You could even talk about cultural and social globalization, which appears to be continuing apace. So do you draw any distinction in the book between the different types of globalization?
That's an excellent question, James. And the way globalization was conceived in the late 80s and early 90s was that it would be this all-encompassing package, right? That we, the West, would export our market economy to first to China, then to the countries behind the Iron Curtain, where they emerged from behind the Iron Curtain, and that the belief was that if they introduce market economy, then a democracy, liberal democracy, will follow, will inevitably follow. And we because we love our liberal democracy so much, and we think that that's the best way of organizing a society. We just assumed that that's what those countries would want, and a number of those countries wanted it. If you look at Poland, if you look at other former Warsaw Pact states, but it's not. What we discovered is that not every country wants that. China wanted market economy, but without liberal democracy, and that's where ties began to fray between China and us, because they didn't want any of our suggestions about how they could better protect human rights and minority groups and so forth, and people's rights to free speech. They wanted to do market economy their way without liberal democracy. And the same thing, obviously, with Russia, which used to be such a promising student of Western market economy and liberal democracy, and now is not a very good student of either, and doesn't want to be a student of it to begin with. And that is, I think, the realization that other countries may want our same standard of living, they will want consumer goods, but they don't want our way of life, or at least the regimes may not want our way of life.
Do you think there are, though, legitimate criticisms of globalization and the way it's been managed? I mean, a lot of people in the West would complain about aspects of neoliberal economic policy. They complain increasingly about the impact of mass migration. Do you think there are legitimate criticisms of globalization and the way it's been managed?
There are, and I think the irony is that the people who, the minority of people who protested against globalization in the early days, namely laid off factory workers here at home, they've been proven right, and yet the establishment looked down on them back then and said, get with it, and there will be other jobs, and it's much better this way. Consumer goods will be cheaper this way, and this is just the future, and so you just have to accept it. And now we have discovered the vulnerability of globe-spanning supply chains and the vulnerability of making a lot of our goods in countries that have now become more hostile. So those people who were seen as sort of leftovers from a previous era of more goods being made at home at obviously higher prices, those people have been proven right, and this is really the irony. It's really the victory of factory workers over the political and academic elite.
And was that a tactical mistake on behalf of the proponents of globalization? Because they used the language of inevitability around globalization as if there was nothing you could do with it and you had to learn to accept it. And therefore, when you have populist figures emerging who say, actually, I will oppose globalization, you are giving agency to those who feel left behind, and they try to reverse it.
That is indeed the case. And I think if people had been asked, if ordinary citizens had been asked, do you want globalization? Then they would have felt empowered and involved in the process. Obviously, no party would say, do you want globalization? We don't have a referendum on whether people want globalization. It just happened organically. But if they had been consulted, if they had been told, this is what is happening. What do you think should happen to your hometown and indeed to your own factory? Rather than just being told, well, your factory is shutting down forever and you can retrain to maybe get a job in the service industry. Well, what if I don't want a job in the service industry? What if my identity is as a factory worker, a skilled factory worker? If somebody tells you, well, your professional skills are of no significance to anybody else, so just get with the program, then you will rebel and you will become more likely to listen to populists who essentially come and present easy answers to things like globalization. There are no easy answers, but there is fertile ground for those who claim there is. There are easy answers, and the best example of that, of course, is Donald Trump.
Just finally, Elisabeth, do you think almost parts of the West became a bit complacent in almost seeing the post-war consensus, I suppose, as being the new normal, where you had increasing prosperity, where you had relative peace globally, and when you had increasing globalization? But if you look through the span of history, protectionism and conflict is the norm, and maybe we're just returning to that.
We are, and if you just look at any sandbox involving, two or more toddlers, they will play nicely together for a while, but then after a while they will inevitably start fighting, and and countries are just like toddlers in the sandbox. You can be on your best behavior for a while, but when disagreement starts coming up, then you need some sort of global adjudicator or referee to resolve those disagreements. Well, there is no global adjudicator or referee. There are just multilateral organs where countries can try to sort out their differences amongst themselves. But if the differences are serious enough or plentiful enough, then that becomes insurmountable. And I think that's where we are today. And it was naive to assume that we would all just get along. No individual human beings ever get along permanently without any disagreements, and countries are just like that. And then, of course, you have leaders of particular countries who try to exploit that inevitable tension between countries and stoke the tension and stoke the disagreement with other countries.
Well, the book is called Goodbye Globalization, The Return of a Divided World. It's out in February. Elisabeth, thanks so much for joining us on Frontline.
Thank you.
Thank you for watching this episode of Frontline for Times Radio. For more on the war in Ukraine, subscribe to the Times Radio YouTube channel, listen to Times Radio on your digital radio, or you can read the Times online with your digital subscription or in print. Thank you and goodbye.